It's been 20 years, Tom Redfern. I've come back to keep a promise you forgot you made. The storm hit just before sundown. Thunder rolled low across the valley, not violent, just tired like an old man clearing his throat. Thomas Redfern stood at the edge of his barn, watching dark clouds stretch their fingers across the Arizona sky. The scent of rain clung to the air like old grief. A calf was missing. He'd counted them twice 7 in the north paddock, 3 by the mesquite trees, but the smallest, a speckled one born too early and barely strong enough to stand, hadn't come in with the rest. Tom muttered under his breath, grabbed his rope and set out toward the gulch. His boots sank into the soft dirt as wind cut sharp through the sagebrush. Somewhere behind him, the barn door banged open and shut in the rising gusts. He didn't look back. Every storm feels like a warning these days. Maybe because Clara had died 15 years back. Maybe because the quiet afterward always settled too deep in his bones. He found the calf near the dry creek bed, trembling and wedged under a twisted branch. Mud caked its legs. Its breathing was shallow ribs fluttering like a hummingbird's wings. "Easy now," Tom whispered, lowering to one knee. His joints popped and protested, but his hands stayed steady. He pulled the branch aside, scooped the calf into his arms, and rose slow. The first drops fell just as he turned for home. They weren't heavy, not yet, but he felt it in the wind, the kind of rain that came fast, flash flooding the dry veins of the land without warning. Red Creek might be bone dry 9 months of the year, but when it ran like vengeance. By the time he reached the barn, his shirt clung to him, and the calf's soft bleats were barely audible. He settled it on dry straw, covering it with a blanket, and whispering whatever words he could summon. He stayed there for a while, letting the thunder roll. When the rain finally eased, night had fallen. The world outside was slick with moonlight on wet dirt. Tom stepped out under the awning and lit a smoke. His boots squelched in the mud. And that's when he saw her. A horse approached slowly from the south trail, silhouetted by the rising moon. Its rider didn't rush. Whoever they were, they knew where they were going. Tom's hand drifted to the handle of his old Colt out of habit more than fear. Strangers didn't just show up at Redfern Ranch, especially not women riding alone after a storm. The horse stopped at the gate. The rider swung down with practiced grace. A woman young, mid to late 20s, Apache by the looks of her, wearing a leather skirt, soft riding boots, and a light-colored blouse tucked neat at the waist. Her long black hair hung wet over her shoulders. She didn't flinch when their eyes met. Tom stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ma'am," he said, brushing the rain from his hat. "You lost?" Her gaze didn't waver. Her voice was quiet, but it carried like steel under silk. "No, sir. I came here on purpose." That stopped him cold. She looked at him the way someone looks at a photograph they've memorized. "Do I know you?" he asked. "You did once? Though I don't expect you to remember." Tom frowned. The storm, the years, the face didn't add up. Not yet. She took a step closer, boots squelching in the mud. 20 years ago," she said softly, "there was a flood near Red Creek. A little girl was trapped in the current. Most folks stood back. But one cowboy tied himself to a fence post and went in after her." The memory hit like a blow to the chest. Tom staggered back a step. That day had carved itself into his bones, the rope burning in his palms, the girl clinging to a tree branch, her cries nearly lost in the rain. He hadn't thought of it in years. "You're her," he said, voice hoarse. The woman nodded. "My name is Ayasha Morningstar. I was 8 years old. You saved me, and I've been looking for you ever since." The wind died down around them. Tom stared at her, unsure what to say, unsure if this was some dream spun by a stormy night and a guilty heart. But there was something in her face, something strong and familiar. She hadn't come by mistake. "I don't—" he began, then stopped. He looked down at the mud, then back at her. "Why now?" After all this time, Ayasha stepped forward. The distance between them vanished with a single sentence. "It's been 20 years, Tom Redfern. I've come back to keep a promise you forgot you made." Tom felt the words sink into him, like the rain had sunk into the land. Heavy, unshakable. What promise, he asked, barely above a whisper. She smiled, small and sad. "You told me stay brave. Life will test you, but don't let it break you." I never forgot that, and I swore to myself if I ever found the man who gave me those words, I'd offer him mine. He didn't move. Couldn't. His hands felt too old, his chest too tight. The silence between them stretched so wide it might have swallowed the whole valley. But she didn't rush him. She simply looked at the old cowboy standing in the barn light, with lines on his face and dust on his boots, and waited. He swallowed hard. "You come all this way. Just for that I didn't come to thank you." "Mr. Redfern," she said, stepping past him toward the porch. "I came to stay." Inside the cabin, Tom pours 2 cups of coffee with hands that can't stop shaking. Ayesha stands by the hearth, the glow of the fire catching in her dark eyes. The rain taps gently on the roof, as if asking permission to keep falling. She sips slowly. He watches her silent. Finally, she looks up. "Do you remember what you told me that day, Tom?" He shakes his head. "No," she says gently. "But I do." And just like that, the past becomes present, and the story truly begins. The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, the rain had dwindled to a hush, the kind that settles into the earth like a secret. Tom Redfern sat at the edge of his chair, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, steam curling up toward his face. Across the table, Ayesha Morningstar sat upright, poised and silent, her eyes never leaving his. He hadn't said much since she walked into his cabin. Truth be told, he didn't know what to say. 20 years was a long time. Long enough for a man to bury more than just memories. She took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down gently. Her gaze didn't waver. "You want to know why now?" she said. "Why after all these years?" Tom nodded slowly. Ayesha looked into the flames for a moment, as if drawing strength from their glow. "I didn't come because I needed closure. I came because you gave me a beginning." He raised an eyebrow, unsure what she meant. She leaned forward, just slightly. "You didn't just save me from the river, Tom. You saved everything I could become." The words hit him like the first breath after being underwater too long. He blinked, his grip tightening around the mug. Ayesha smiled faintly. Not a sweet smile, more like something earned. "You probably don't remember much from that day," she said. "But I do. I remember everything. The water was loud, cold. I couldn't scream anymore and my voice was gone. I remember my fingers slipping off that branch, and then I saw your face. You didn't hesitate. You were soaked to the bone, yelling something I couldn't hear, and the next second you had me in your arms. You wrapped me in your coat, held me until the others came." Tom looked down at his boots. "I remember it rained for 3 days after that," he said quietly. "The creek flooded the whole damn valley." "I remember what you told me too," she said. "Right before I fell asleep, wrapped in that heavy coat of yours. You said, 'Stay brave, little one. Life will test you, but don't let it break you.' I held on to that." Tom chuckled bitterly. "That just sounds like something a cowboy says to calm a kid." "Maybe to you," she said, "but to me it was gospel." She sat back, hands resting lightly on her lap. "After the flood, my people moved south. Our camp was gone. My father broke his leg during the evacuation. My mother." She paused, cleared her throat. She didn't survive the illness that followed. It was just me and my little brother after that. I had to grow up fast. Tom's chest ached, but he kept quiet. "I learned healing from the old women," she continued. "Plants, roots, poultices. We moved from one camp to another farm, helping where we could. I worked with the sick, the wounded. I buried people before I turned 15. He looked up, finally meeting her eyes. You went through all that because of a flood I barely remember. No, she said. I lived through it because of you. The fire snapped loudly between them. Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything. They sat in silence for a while, the way two people do when words aren't enough to bridge everything that's happened in their separate lives. Finally, Tom spoke. You really been looking for me all this time, Ayasha nodded. I kept asking around. Sometimes I'd find someone who remembered a cowboy named Redfern who ran cattle through Apache land. Other times I'd hit dead ends. Took me years just to find out you were still in Arizona. Tom ran a hand over his graying beard, though no one remembered that day. Hell, most days, I wasn't even sure it was real. It was real, she said, voice steady. Real enough to build a life from. He stared at her for a long moment. You could have done anything with your life. Why come here? To this ranch, to me. She looked around the cabin, simple wooden filled with the smell of coffee and smoke, with old pictures on the mantel and a saddle near the door. I needed to see if the man who saved me was still that man. And if he's not, Tom asked, voice low, then I would have left. But he is. He shook his head. I'm not who I used to be. Hell, I ain't sure I ever was. I've buried more friends than I can name. Lost my wife to sickness. Spent years talking more to horses than people. Ayasha didn't flinch. I didn't come looking for a perfect man, Tom. I came to see the one who changed everything. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. So now what? That depends, she said gently, on whether you'll let someone stay. The wind picked up outside, whistling against the window pane. Rain had started again, softer this time, like the land was catching its breath. Tom stood slowly, his knees creaking, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He hesitated, then filled hers too. When he handed it to her, she smiled, a real one this time. He returned to his chair, sipping slowly. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. You don't have to know, she replied. You just have to let it happen. They drank in silence again, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was expectant. Finally, she looked at him across the rim of her cup. Will you show me around tomorrow? The ranch, I mean. Tom nodded. Sure. Not much to see, but it's yours to look at. Everything matters, she said softly, when it's tied to a memory. They sat by the fire until it died low, until the room was just shadows and breath. He offered her the guest room across the hall. She thanked him, disappeared quietly, her footsteps light on the old floorboards. Tom stayed a while longer in his chair, staring at the embers. You didn't just save me from the river, Tom, you saved everything I could become. He whispered the words back to himself, almost in disbelief. Then, for the first time in years, he smiled. Just a little. The next morning, the land was washed clean. Ayasha was already awake, standing on the porch, watching the light spread across the valley. Tom stepped beside her, coffee in hand. You sleep all right, I did, she said. This place, it doesn't feel strange. You'll change your mind after mending fences in a windstorm. She smirked. I've faced worse. He nodded toward the pasture. Cattle need moving today. Might get your boots muddy. I brought them for that. He looked at her again. Calm, ready, rooted. And though he didn't say it aloud, something inside him shifted. The silence didn't feel so loud anymore. Tomorrow he'd take her into town for supplies. And that's when the rest of the world would start to notice and talk. Tom hadn't shared a breakfast table with anyone in almost a decade. He didn't say much about it, didn't know how, but the eggs he cooked that morning were the best he'd bothered to make in years. Crisp edges, warm bread, coffee poured strong and steady. Ayasha ate with quiet appreciation. No need for small talk. She didn't fill the space with chatter. She simply fit in it like she'd always belonged there. After they cleaned up, Tom handed her a worn pair of gloves and motioned toward the pasture. If you're still set on helping, he said, I've got a gate that's been swinging loose for a month. It might be time it stopped. She took the gloves without hesitation. Lead the way. They walked side by side through the tall grass boots brushing against dew-soaked stalks. The storm from the night before had left the land soft and damp, the kind of earth that held footprints like a memory. Horses lifted their heads as they passed, watching silently. Ayesha worked with confidence, quiet, focused, and deliberate. Tom kept stealing glances at her. He hadn't expected her to stay more than a night. Maybe two. But there she was, steady as sunrise, hammering nails and pulling wire like she'd done it all her life. They finished before noon. Tom leaned against the fence post, sweat on his brow, breath slow and even. Ayesha joined him, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She looked out across the open land. "This place has seen a lot of years," she said. He nodded. "And more ghosts than I care to count." She didn't ask. Just stood beside him in silence, letting the wind speak where words couldn't. Later, back at the barn, Tom brushed down his horse while Ayesha sorted rope from a weathered wooden bin. That's when Elias Greycloud showed up, broad-shouldered, leathery-skinned, his long black braid streaked with silver. He rode up slowly, dismounted with ease, and tied his mare to the post. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, eyeing the woman standing in his best friend's barn. "You got company, Tom. And she ain't a mare." Tom signed. "Elias, meet Ayesha Morningstar." Elias tipped his hat. "Pleasure, ma'am." Ayesha nodded. "Likewise." Tom shot Elias a look that said, "Don't start," but the blacksmith only grinned. "You finally let someone in this godforsaken place," he said. "Took long enough." Tom didn't answer. Ayesha just smiled, returning to her task, like she'd known Elias all her life. The three of them sat on the porch later, drinking coffee under a sky that promised more sun than storm. Elias rocked slowly in the chair he'd carved for Tom years ago, the same one Clara used to sit in before the cancer took her. So Elias said, glancing sideways at Tom, "You gonna tell me what brought her here, or do I gotta guess?" Tom hesitated. Ayesha beat him to it. "He saved my life 20 years ago," she said. "I was a girl caught in the flood down near Red Creek. He pulled me out." Elias leaned back, brow lifting. "Well, I'll be. I've been searching for him since," she added. "And I made a vow. If I ever found the man who gave me life, I'd offer him mine. I made a vow, Tom Redfern. If I ever found the man who gave me life, I'd offer him mine." The words didn't hang. They sank. Deep into the wood of the porch, the silence and whatever was left of Tom's chest. He stared at the horizon. Couldn't meet her eyes. Elias let out a low whistle. "That right there's the kind of thing folks write songs about." Tom muttered, "Don't need no song." Ayesha sipped her coffee. "You don't have to decide anything now," she said gently. "I didn't come to press you. I just came to be near the man who gave me something worth remembering." Elias stood, his boots creaking on the porch. "Well, I should be heading back. Hammer ain't gonna swing itself." He nodded at Ayesha. "You've got grit, ma'am. Don't let him run from that." She smiled. "I won't." When Elias was gone, Tom stood quietly watching the dust settle from his friend's departure. "You make it sound easy," he said after a long pause. "What part?" Ayesha asked. "Coming here. Saying what you said. Like it doesn't weigh a damn ton." Ayesha stood slowly. I walked down off the porch, turned to face him under the open sky. "It does weigh a ton, Tom. Every mile I rode. Every town I passed through not knowing if you were even still alive. Every day I wondered if I was chasing a memory instead of a man." She took a step closer. "But I'd carry that weight 100 times if it brought me back here." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The wind picked up, rustling the wildflowers along the fence line. "I ain't young anymore," he said finally. "I ain't got much left to give." "I'm not here to take it," she said. "I'm here to share." He looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel alone in his own skin. That night, as the sun dipped low and the world turned to gold, Ayasha sat on the porch, sewing something by lantern light. Tom watched her from inside the cabin, his rough hands resting on the table. He didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because something had shifted. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew she wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Tom packed the wagon. "Where are we going?" Ayasha asked. "Town," he said. She raised a brow. "You sure?" He nodded. "I need supplies, and folks are going to talk either way. Might as well let 'em see what they're talking about." Ayasha smiled. "Then let's ride." He tipped his hat. "Stay close," he said. "That place eats people alive if you don't know where to look." And with that, they rode out toward a town that wasn't ready for them, and the words that would soon come to test everything they'd just begun to build. The trail into Sawmill Junction cut through dusty hills and sun-scorched chaparral, the kind of place where even the wind seemed to gossip. The town wasn't big, just one main street, a row of weathered buildings, a general store, a livery, a saloon, and a church that rang only on Sundays and funerals. Tom Redfern hadn't ridden into town with anyone in nearly 6 years, and never with a woman riding beside him. Ayasha kept pace without effort, her back straight in the saddle, her eyes calm. She wore a simple skirt, her hair braided with red thread that shimmered against the sun. She didn't smile or wave. She just watched quietly, steadily, as heads began to turn. By the time they hitched their horses in front of the general store, the whispers had already started. "Who's that with Redfern? She looks like an Apache. She's staying out at the ranch, I heard." "Well, ain't that something?" Tom heard every word, even the ones they thought he didn't. He stepped inside first, the familiar ring of the doorbell, marking his entrance. Rosita Delgado looked up from behind the counter. Mid-40s, still striking in a tired kind of way, her dark curls tied up in a red scarf. Her gaze landed on Tom, then shifted to the woman just behind him. She paused. "Morning, Tom," Rosita said slowly. "Rosita." Then to Ayasha, "Ma'am." Ayasha gave a polite nod. "Good morning." Rosita's eyes lingered a second too long, then dropped to the ledger on the counter. "What can I help you with, flour, coffee, oats?" "Nails. A new bridle if you got one." Rosita nodded. "I'll pull it together." As she moved through the store gathering items, Tom wandered the aisles with Ayasha close behind. The store smelled of leather dust and cinnamon from a cracked barrel near the register. Outside, the murmurs grew louder. "Don't much care for the way they look at you," Tom muttered. Ayasha glanced at the door. "They don't see a woman. They see a story they want to tear apart. They don't see a woman. They see a story they want to tear apart." Tom turned to her. "You always talk like you've been through a war." She looked him dead in the eyes. "I have. Just not the kind you read about in books." Rosita returned with the supplies bundled in burlap. "That'll be $7, Tom." He handed her the coins and nodded toward Ayasha. "She's helping me out on the ranch for a while." Rosita raised her brows slightly. "I figured as much." Tom caught the edge in her tone but didn't respond. He gathered the supplies and stepped outside. Ayasha followed her face, unreadable. They were halfway to the wagon when someone called out from across the street. "Hey, Redfern." Tom turned. A tall, thick-jawed man stood on the porch of the saloon, drinking hand dust on his boots. Frank Mallory. Owned a dozen head of cattle and twice as many opinions. "That's your new squaw," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The words sliced the air like broken glass. Tom frozen. Ayasha didn't flinch. Mallory smirked, lifting his glass. "She fixin' fences or warmin' your bed?" The porch behind him erupted in ugly laughter. Tom dropped the supply bundle. I walked across the street in silence. Every step was slow measured. When he reached the saloon, he didn't speak. He just swung right hook clean and fast. Mallory crumpled backward into a post, his glass shattering beside him. The laughter stopped. Tom stood over him, voice cold and clear. You speak about her like that again, you'll leave this town with fewer teeth than you came in with. He turned, walked back across the street, picked up the bundle, and tossed it into the wagon. Ayasha said nothing. They rode out of town with every pair of eyes watching them go. Halfway back to the ranch, Tom finally spoke. You didn't say a word. I've heard worse, she said. You shouldn't have to. Ayasha looked over at him. That's not your burden to carry. He shook his head. It is now. The rest of the ride was silent, save for the creak of leather tongue and the soft clip of hooves on dirt. When they reached the ranch, Tom jumped down, began unloading the wagon. Ayasha joined him. Townfolk'll keep talking, he said. They always do. I don't want you to be hurt by it. She paused. Tom, I've been judged for the color of my skin, the tribe I was born into, the way I speak, the way I ride the herbs I use to heal people, and the silence I keep. But none of it ever broke me. I won't let this place be the first. He looked at her, unsure what to say, so he just nodded. That night he sat alone on the porch after she'd gone to bed, watching stars scatter across the sky like ash from an old fire. He thought about what she'd said, and what Mallory had said. He didn't feel ashamed, but he felt something close, the quiet rage of a man who wanted to do right by someone and didn't know if he could. The next morning came early. Tom found Ayasha in the pasture feeding the horses. One of the mares, usually shy, had her head nestled against Ayasha's shoulder, nuzzling her like kin. She likes you, he said. Ayasha smiled softly, brushing the animal's mane. Animals always know who means no harm. Tom watched her for a long moment. Are you still sure you want to stay? I came here on purpose, Tom. I'm not going anywhere just because some people don't like the look of me. He nodded, then cleared his throat. I was thinking, might ride out tomorrow. Check the far fence line. It's a long trip. Are you up for it? She looked at him, eyes steady. I've already come this far. And so the next day, they would ride out beyond the edges of what either of them had touched in years, toward places where fences sagged, but hearts might hold. The sky stretched out wide and empty, a pale canvas brushed with the soft gold of morning. The wind was light, but constant, whispering through the brittle grass and tugging at the corners of Tom's coat. He adjusted the saddle on his old bay gelding, checking the cinch like muscle memory. Ayasha was already mounted on the pinto mare she'd grown fond of, Dustflower she'd named her. They'd packed light, a coil of rope, a rifle waterskins jerky, and a canvas bag of tools. The south fence line ran along a steep ridge that hadn't been ridden in months. It would take most of the day. You sure you're up for this? Tom asked, squinting up at her from the ground. Ayasha gave a half smile. Try to keep up. Tom shook his head, mounted, and they rode out side by side through the open land. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It never had been. Words with Ayasha weren't wasted. She didn't speak to fill space. When she spoke, it mattered. They passed a stretch of burned-out cedar where lightning had struck the year before. The blackened trunks leaned like tired soldiers, brittle and twisted. Storm did that, she asked. Same one that killed 4 heads of cattle, Tom replied. Wind took the roof off the smokehouse, too. Ayasha ran a gloved hand over one of the scorched trees as they rode by. The land remembers everything, doesn't it? Every wound, Tom said. Every fire. By midday, they reached the south fence line. 2 posts had collapsed and the wire sagged between them like an old man's shoulders. Tom dismounted, set down his bag, and got to work. Ayasha tied off her horse, pulled on her gloves, and started clearing the brush near the posts. You don't have to do that, Tom said. I can manage. I know, she said, not stopping. But I didn't come here to watch you fall over. He smirked. Not fallen over. Not yet. They worked in rhythm, hammering stakes, tightening wire, replacing nails. The wind picked up as the sun climbed, turning the sky harsh and dry. Sweat beaded down Tom's back. He glanced over and saw Ayasha tying off the last wire with precision. "Have you done this before?" he asked. "Fences, no. Binding things together, yes." He looked at her, puzzled. "Ropes, branches, wounds," she explained. "My hands learned early." As they finished, Dustflower let out a whinny. Ayasha turned, brow tightening. The mare pawed at the dirt, nervous. Tom followed her gaze and saw the dust cloud rolling in. "Damn," he muttered. A storm wasn't on the forecast. "There are no forecasts out here," she said calmly. "Only signs. And that cloud's moving fast." They mounted up quickly and turned north, urging their horses into a steady loop. The wind shifted sharply, hot and dry. Dust stung their faces as the air turned thick. Behind them, the wall of grit and wind roared louder by the second. Tom shouted, "We won't outrun it! That arroyo ahead, we can drop into the cut." Ayasha nodded, heels pressing into Dustflower's sides. They reached the edge of the dry wash just as the storm hit. Wind howled like a wounded beast. Sand scraped skin, filled mouths, stung eyes. They guided their horses down into the low ravine using the embankment as a shield. Tom dismounted, tying his horse to a root. Ayasha followed her braid, whipping around her face. She crouched beside him behind a ledge of rock, pressing her scarf to her mouth. For a long moment, the world vanished into dust and sound. When it finally began to ease, the wind falling like breath after a scream, they remained crouched in silence. Tom coughed, wiped his eyes. "You all right?" She nodded. Her face was smudged, her scarf damp with dust and sweat, but her eyes were steady. "That's your first desert storm?" he asked. "First that found me off guard." Tom sat back against the rock, breathing heavy. His knees ached. His hands were scraped raw. "You could have stayed back at the ranch," he said. "I came here for more than warm fires," she answered. "I don't bend to survive, Tom. I root." He looked at her. Something about the way she said it, not loud, not proud, just certain, sat heavy in his chest. "I've known plenty of people who run when things get hard," he said. "I'm not one of them." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the tail end of the storm roll eastward. The land smelled like earth and iron. Horses nickered quietly nearby, spooked but unharmed. "Have you always been this stubborn?" he asked. "Only when it matters." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You talk like an old soul." "Maybe I am." They rested until the dust settled completely, then climbed out of the arroyo and checked the horses. Dustflower had a cut above her hoof. Ayasha knelt and began cleaning it with water from her skin and herbs from a pouch she always carried at her waist. Tom watched her. Something about the way her hands moved gently, but unflinching, made him feel something he hadn't in years. Not admiration, not attraction. Something deeper, a recognition. "I had a wife," he said, voice quiet. "Clara. She passed away 13 years ago." Ayasha didn't look up. "I figured. She used to sing while she worked. Just low enough you'd forget it was a song until it stopped." Ayasha poured the last of the water over Dustflower's leg. "You loved her. I did. And now..." He didn't answer. The question floated there between the heat and dust, and two people bound by something they didn't yet have a name for. They rode home slow, quiet, the horses tired, and the sun low. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a promise they hadn't earned, but somehow still belonged to. As they reached the barn, Ayasha slid off her horse and began unpacking without being asked. Tom stood beside her, brushing off his coat. "You handled yourself today," he said. "I didn't come here to be handled." He smiled. "Fair enough." That night after supper, Tom sat on the porch, boots up, the stars beginning to blink into the velvet sky. Ayasha sat nearby, mending the hem of an old blanket she'd found in the storage trunk. After a long stretch of silence, she spoke without looking up. "Storms don't scare me, Tom. What scares me is standing still in a place where nothing grows. He turned to her. And this place, you think it can grow, I think it already is. In the morning, Tom would take her with him to check the north pasture closer to town, closer to where the whispers still lingered. And this time he wouldn't just be wondering what people thought. He'd be wondering what it might cost to care. The north pasture rode closer to town, and that meant closer to trouble. Tom and Ayasha moved quietly through the morning haze, their horses plodding along a narrow trail lined with brittle fence posts and swaying mesquite. It was cooler today, cool enough for breath to ghost in the air, but neither of them mentioned it. Something else was hanging there. He felt it like static before a lightning strike. They were 5 minutes into the ride when he finally said what had been gnawing at him since the storm. "You said you came here for more than warm fires." Ayasha turned in her saddle, slightly waiting. He hesitated, then added, "You come here to make a life, or to repay a debt." Ayasha's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed. She slowed her mare and let the silence sit between them for a moment. "This isn't a repayment, Tom. You didn't give me a favor. You gave me direction." He didn't reply right away. She looked out across the field. "I spent years thinking I owed you something. Then I realized it's not about debt. It's about purpose. You taught me what bravery looks like. You didn't even know you were doing it." He swallowed. The weight in his chest didn't lift, but it shifted and turned into something warmer and heavier all at once. "You should know," she added, "purpose doesn't end with one life saved." They reached the fence line which ran near the edge of town, close enough to see the roof of the church steeple in the distance. One of the posts had been pushed down by cattle or weather, and the wire lay twisted in the dust like discarded thoughts. As Tom swung off his horse to inspect the damage, hoofbeats echoed down the ridge behind them. He stood slowly. 2 riders approached, one he recognized immediately. Sheriff Amos Lyle, tall and pale with a limp that hadn't softened his presence. The second was Frank Mallory, his face still bruised from their last encounter, smug as ever. Tom straightened, stepping forward. "Sheriff?" "Tom." The sheriff's gaze moved to Ayasha, who remained mounted, calm and unreadable. "You heard about the council meeting yesterday?" Amos asked. "Nope. They talked about you," Tom raised a brow. And there's concern about you keeping company with someone who what?" Tom interrupted. "Someone whose presence might stir things up." "Tensions. Ain't exactly a secret. Frank's filed a complaint." Frank spat in the dirt. "She doesn't belong here." Ayasha didn't blink. "Neither do the fences cutting up my people's land. But here we are." Amos sighed. "Look, I'm not here to make this uglier than it needs to be. But folks are talking, Tom. Loud enough that if there's another incident, the town council may look at pushing for legal action." "On what grounds?" Tom asked sharply. "Being rude in public on grounds of disruption, reputation, stability." Tom stepped forward. "She's not a threat, and she's not going anywhere." Frank leaned on the horn of his saddle. "Maybe she ain't the threat. Maybe you are forgetting which side you're on." Ayasha finally dismounted, landing soft but steady on the dirt. She walked up beside Tom, calm as dawn. "You want to push me out because I'm Apache," she said evenly. "Just say it. Don't dress it up in politics and civility." The sheriff didn't respond. She looked at Tom. "Let's go." They mounted and rode off without waiting for permission. Tom didn't look back, but he felt the eyes burning holes in his spine. Back at the ranch, he slammed the gate shut, harder than needed. Ayasha unsaddled her mare, quiet and methodical. "They won't stop," he said. "They'll keep pressing." "I know. They might even come out here. Try to intimidate. Might try worse." She didn't flinch. "Let them come." Tom's voice dropped low. "I buried my wife under that cottonwood. I won't bury anyone else." She turned to him, meeting his fear with fire. I'm not something fragile you found and need to protect. I'm the woman who came here on her own terms. I stood in front of men like that before. I'll do it again." He exhaled long and slow. His shoulders slumped as if the air had finally gone out of him. I never thought bringing someone in would feel this dangerous." Ayasha softened. She stepped closer, resting her hand on his arm. "Love is dangerous, Tom. But not because of who it holds, because of who it threatens." The truth of it hit him harder than anything Mallory could have said. They stood like that for a while, two people in the quiet of a ranch, too old and too scared to forget its past. But somewhere in that silence, something stronger bloomed. Not just love, defiance. Later that evening, Elias rode in. He saw their faces before he heard the full story. Sheriff came by, Tom nodded. With Mallory, Elias spit into the dirt. Cowards, both of them. Town council's made of ghosts and drunks. Let 'em try to enforce something. This is Redfern land. Tom paced near the porch. That might not be enough. Not if they stir up fear. Ayasha looked at Elias. "Do you know anyone in town who might stand with us, speak on our behalf?" Elias nodded slowly. "One or two. Maybe Rosita. Preacher Wells, if he's not too afraid of his congregation." Ayesha's jaws set firm. Then it's time they stop whispering and start standing. Tom looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. He'd always fought quietly and survived by staying just under the flame. But Ayasha had brought the fire right to his door, and now it was either burned or stained. The next day, Ayasha would walk into the town council meeting uninvited, with or without an invitation. And Tom, for the first time in years, would walk beside someone not to protect them, but to be seen beside them. They were no longer trying to be accepted. They were here to be undeniable. The church bell rang sharp over Sawmill Junction as noon struck, a brittle, echoing clang that usually called folks to sermon or supper. Today, it summoned something else: confrontation. Tom adjusted the collar of his worn shirt and watched Ayasha tie her braid with quiet precision. She wore her ceremonial shawl, deep indigo with silver stitching down the spine like lightning caught in fabric. She didn't wear it for the show. She wore it like armor. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked. Ayasha met his eyes. Calm. Grounded. They built their rules without me. But today I walked in as myself. I was never lost, Tom. I was just waiting for the world to see me whole. Tom nodded. No more convincing her. No more softening edges. If the town was going to burn its gaze into her, let them burn. They hitched the wagon just past the general store. Heads turned. Of course they did. Rosita Delgado watched from her doorway. Her apron was still dusted with flour, but her eyes tracked them like something mattered. Ayasha stepped off the wagon, first shoulders square, chin high. Tom followed, silent as stone. They didn't say a word as they walked into the town hall. The place was half full of councilmen seated at the long pine table, folks scattered on wooden benches. Frank Mallory was already leaning back in his seat, arms crossed, mouth curled in satisfaction, like he'd already won. Sheriff Lyle sat nearby, eyes cautious. The room quieted the second Ayasha stepped in. Councilman Willoughby cleared his throat. "Miss Morningstar, you weren't scheduled to speak." "I didn't come for your schedule," she replied. "I came to be heard." Willoughby blinked, unused to being spoken to like that, especially not from a woman, and especially not one who wasn't white. Tom stepped forward. "She speaks or I walk, and I don't walk alone." Willoughby looked at the other two old ranchers and a clerk from the bank who had never set foot outside town lines. "Fine," he said. "You've got 5 minutes." Ayasha walked forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. The floorboards creaked under her boots, like they remembered her weight before she'd ever carried it here. "I've listened to the whispers," she began, voice clear but not loud. "And now I speak." A few folks shuffled in their seats. Someone at the back coughed. I'm not here to disrupt your order. I'm here because someone from this town once gave me a chance to live, and now I've come back not to repay, but to build. She looked at Mallory. You fear me because you don't know me. You think I've come to change your ways. But I haven't. I've come to live mine. Frank scoffed. You want people to believe this ain't some stunt. Ayasha didn't blink. Your fear is not my burden. Willoughby held up a hand. Let's keep this civil. Tom stepped beside her now, his voice like gravel. It's been civil long enough. Civil's just another word for quiet while you bleed. Gasps, murmurs. Rosita Delgado stood at the back, now arms crossed, nodding. Ayasha continued. I was raised to respect land people and silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. I am not a guest here. I am a seed planted long ago, finally breaking through the ground. Someone from the benches stood. Preacher Wells. I baptized your wife, Tom, he said, voice trembling. I buried her. She was a good woman. She was, Tom answered. Wells turned to Ayasha. You believe in the Lord, I believe in justice, in kindness, in a world where we don't have to ask permission to exist. He paused, then sat. The council leaned into hushed whispers. Willoughby looked at the paper in front of him like it might spare him the weight of the room. Frank stood again, louder now. She's poisonous. Doesn't matter what she says. People like her, Rosita's voice cut through like a blade. You mean women who aren't afraid? Frank turned. This ain't your business, Rosita. Rosita stepped forward, apron still on fingers dusted in flour. She's more decent than half the men who drink at your table. You don't get to say who belongs and who doesn't. A slow murmur built. Even the banker shifted in his seat. Ayasha looked to Tom, then to the council. I don't want your pity. I want your recognition. And if I don't get it, I'll still be here living, riding, planting, healing. You can't vote me away. Tom put his hand on hers. The weight of everything they were standing against pressed down on their backs, but their spine held. Councilman Willoughby cleared his throat. We've heard your words. We'll discuss and issue a response. Tom laughed once, short, dry. We didn't come for a verdict. We came to be seen. And with that, they left. Back outside, the sun had risen higher, brighter. People were still whispering, but it felt different now. Not all poison. Some possibility. They rode out in silence, passing fields that hadn't bloomed in years. Tom broke it first. You were fired in there. Ayasha gave a half smile. Not fire, just the truth. Back at the ranch, Elias waited by the porch, watching the dust rise from their return. He didn't need to ask how it went. He could see it in the way they rode, tired but tall. You stirred the pot, he said. Ayasha nodded. It needed stirring. That night, Tom found her outside beneath the stars. She sat with a journal in her lap, sketching something in ink. What are you drawing? She held up a rough sketch of a tree, deep roots and lightning across the sky above it. The cottonwood, he asked. She nodded. Something that bends but never breaks. Tomorrow word will spread. Some would spit it out. Others would let it settle. But none could ignore it now. The woman no one expected had stood her ground, and the man who saved her had finally found something worth saving again. The first fire started just after midnight. Tom smelled the smoke before he saw the light. It wasn't the sharp, controlled scent of a hearth. It was wild, thick, and angry. He bolted upright, grabbing his rifle by instinct. By the time he made it to the porch, the southern edge of the corral was glowing orange flames, licking up the dry fence posts like fingers. Damn it, he muttered. Ayasha was already outside, barefoot, hair down a bucket in each hand. They moved fast. Elias appeared moments later, drawn by instinct or maybe some ghost of loyalty. Together they beat the fire back with water shovels and blankets soaked from the trough. It took nearly an hour, but they got it under control. By dawn, the corral was blackened. Half the fences gone. One of the younger horses had a burn on its flank. Not deep, but angry. Tom stood over the damage hands on his hips, chest heaving. Ayesha ran a hand along the signed post. This wasn't lightning, or an accident. No, Tom growled. This was a message. They couldn't silence us in town, so they came for what we love. Ayesha turned to Elias. Did you see anything? Hear anyone? Elias shook his head. Not a sound. And I was sleeping lighter than usual, knowing what might come. Tom spat in the dirt. This is what cowards do. Wait till dark. Hurt what can't fight back. Ayesha said nothing. Her eyes followed the broken fence line out into the hills. Something behind them was burning too many memories. Some truth. We can rebuild the fence, she said. But the fear, that's the real fire. That's what they want to spread. Tom's jaw tensed. They want me to send you away. Then they're wasting their match. Later that morning, Tom rode into town, alone. He tied his horse tighter than usual outside the sheriff's office and walked through the door like a man with unfinished business. Sheriff Amos Lyle looked up from his desk, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. Have you heard about the fire? You know damn well I am. The sheriff stood slowly, one leg stiff with age. Nobody reported anything. I've sent men to check the outskirts. You want me to ride out? I want you to grow a spine, Tom snapped. Amos blinked. Watch your tongue. No. You watch your town burn around you while you sit here pretending it's still 1890 and folks like her don't belong. She's stirring things up, Tom. You know that. Tom took a step forward, voice rising. She's living. That's all. She speaks plain. She rides hard. She helps more in one day than most of your men do in a week. Amos held up a hand. I'm not saying I condone what happened. You're not saying it ain't the same as turning your back. The sheriff exhaled long and slow. You think it was Mallory? I think Mallory lit the match, and the town gave him the wood. Back at the ranch, Ayesha and Elias repaired what they could. They worked mostly in silence, save for the sound of hammering and rope tightening. Have you ever thought about leaving? Elias asked quietly. Plenty. What stopped you? Ayesha looked at the scorched earth. Roots don't pull easy once they take hold. He nodded, then said, Tom's a good man. But he's got ghosts. So do I, she said. Maybe that's why we understand each other. By the time Tom returned, the makeshift fencing was up. The burned horse had been treated. Ayesha stood at the edge of the corral, arms crossed, watching the sun dip low. They won't stop, he said, dismounting. No, she agreed. I went to the sheriff, told him everything. And he won't act. Ayesha turned to him. Then we will. That night, Ayesha brought out something she hadn't touched in years, a pouch wrapped in red cloth. Inside were small clay figures, herbs, beads, and a bundle of hawthorn sticks tied in sinew. She laid them on the porch with careful hands. Tom watched from the doorway. What's that protection? Prayer. History. You believe it'll work? She looked up at him, eyes glowing in the lantern light. It already has. I'm still here. They didn't sleep much. In the early hours, a figure moved beyond the north ridge. Tom saw it from the barn window. Just a silhouette against the moonlight, pausing, watching. Then gone. He didn't give chase. Not yet. He just stood there, rifle in hand, heart a steady drum. Ayesha joined him moments later, a shawl over her shoulders. Was it him? Could have been. She nodded once, then leaned into him, the weight of the day pressing against both of them. Let them come, she said. We won't bend. And they didn't. Over the next 2 days, the town grew louder and divided. Some folks stopped talking altogether. Others offered quiet support. Rosita sent extra flour with no charge. Preacher Wells dropped off a Bible weathered and underlined. But the threat didn't fade. Tom knew what was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't be another fire in the dark. It'd be men, guns, power in numbers. And still neither of them left. Because the ranch wasn't just land anymore. It was a declaration. Defense. Home. And the next morning, Tom began reinforcing the outer gates. Ayesha sharpened tools, cleaned the rifles, checked supplies. Elias came early. He brought more than words this time. He brought bullets. And behind all of it was one truth neither of them said out loud. This land would be defended. Not because it was perfect, but because they finally had something worth standing for. The first shot came just before dawn. A sharp crack split the cold morning stillness, echoing across the canyon like a lightning strike in an empty sky. Tom dropped the feed sack and hit the ground, dirt flying. Ayesha crouched near the corral, ducked behind the water trough in one smooth, practiced motion. A second shot rang out closer, meaner. Then silence again. Tom rolled behind the barn wall, heart pounding. He didn't need to see the shooter. He knew what this was. A warning. A test. He crawled along the edge of the building and peeked around the corner. No movement. But there on the ridge above the pasture, a silhouette pulling back into the tree line. Careful. Calculated. Ayesha moved low toward the barn, her eyes sharp, calm. "You see him?" she asked. "Just a shadow," Tom replied. "He'll be back. Men like him don't want to win. They want to break what won't bow." They stayed down for another minute listening. No more shots came. Elias came riding up hard from the east trail a half-hour later, dust on his coat, eyes burning. "I saw tracks," he said before dismounting. "Fresh. At least 2 of them on horseback circled from the ridge. Took off west." Tom nodded. "They weren't aiming to kill." "Not this time," Elias said grimly. Ayesha tied her braid tighter. "They're watching to see what fear tastes like on us." Tom stood brushing dust off his jeans. "Well, they'll go hungry." Inside the house, Ayesha boiled coffee while Elias spread a map across the dining table. "They've got 3 ways in," he said, pointing with a calloused finger. "East slope, dry riverbed, and this trail here behind the cottonwood." Tom leaned over the map. "We set traps on the lower trail. Debris piles at the riverbed. That cottonwood's our weak spot." "I'll cover it," Ayesha said without hesitation. Tom looked at her. "It's the most exposed." She held his gaze. "That's why I'll be there." He didn't argue. Couldn't. She wasn't asking. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the property. Boards nailed, traps set, rifles checked and rechecked. Even the horses were moved to the smaller barn out of sight. It felt like war, not loud or fast, but slow and waiting. The kind that coils around your ribs and tightens with each quiet hour. That night, they ate in silence. Every sound outside the walls made Tom's ears twitch. The wind, an owl, a rustle that might have been a rabbit or something else. Ayesha set her mug down gently. "They're coming tonight." Tom didn't ask how she knew. Some things didn't require explanation. "What do we do if they come in hard?" Elias asked. "We stand," Tom said simply. Ayesha added, "We don't shoot first, but we don't run." They took their positions after midnight. Tom at the barn loft. Elias by the side gate, Ayesha near the cottonwood. Moonlight spilled over the land like a secret waiting to be told. Hours passed. Nothing moved, until it did. A branch snapped. Then another. Tom raised his rifle, sighted movement near the riverbed. 2 figures crouching low, moving like they'd done this before. He held his fire. Closer. Then a loud crack. Elias's warning shot rang through the air. The figures scattered. Shouts echoed across the ridge. Horses whinnied. And then came the charge. 3 riders from the east, barreling through the brush. Another from the ridge. Ayesha fired a clean shot, striking a tree near the rider's head. He veered off course. Tom shouted, "Keep the gate closed." Elias was already there, fending off one of the intruders with the butt of his rifle. The man swung a club, missed, then went down with a blow to the ribs. Ayasha disarmed another who'd made it past the fence quickly, efficiently, using a sweep move and the butt of her knife to drop him cold. It wasn't a long fight. It wasn't clean, either. But when the dust settled, 4 men lay on the ground, 2 unconscious, 1 moaning, 1 scrambling back toward the ridge, empty-handed. Tom stood in the center of the yard, breathing like a bull ready to charge again. Ayasha moved to his side. She had a scrape above her eyebrow, bleeding slightly. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm still standing," she said. Elias checked the bodies. "Frank Mallory's not here." Tom grunted. "Of course not. Cowards never get their hands dirty." One of the intruders stirred, groaning. Elias hauled him up by the collar. "Name." "Walt," the man croaked. "Walt Jennings." Tom stepped in close. "Why'd you come?" "We were just supposed to scare you." Tom grabbed his shirt. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes flicked to Ayasha, then back. "Said she didn't belong. Said we'd be doing the town a favor." Tom's fist clenched. "Tell Mallory this next time he sends boys to do his work. They better come with more than fists and ignorance." Ayasha added quietly, "And tell him we're not afraid." They sent the men limping back toward town as the sky began to glow with the first hint of dawn. The ranch was bruised, but it stood. As they patched the fence together that morning, Tom looked over at Ayasha. "You fought like hell." She smiled, blood drying near her temple. "I've been fighting most of my life. And I'm just getting good at it." Elias chuckled. "They'll be back, you know." "I'm counting on it," Tom said. Later that day, Rosita came riding up with a crate of bandages, food, and news. "Preacher's talking," she said. "Says what happened here last night changes things. Says maybe the church should take a side." Tom raised an eyebrow. "About time someone did." Rosita looked at Ayasha. "You scared half the town." "Only the half that needed scaring," Ayasha replied. Tom leaned against the fence, watching the land stretch out before him, scarred, but his. "Theirs. They thought we'd run." Ayasha nodded. "They don't know us very well." But Mallory wasn't done. And the next move he'd make wouldn't come with noise. It would come wrapped in law. Lies. Papers meant to cut deeper than bullets ever could. The envelope came 2 days later, with no knock, no warning. Just sitting there on the porch rail, white against the worn wood like a rattlesnake in the sun. Tom spotted it first. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, and stopped cold. Ayasha joined him moments later, reading his silence. "What is it?" He didn't answer at first. Just picked it up, studied the embossed seal of Sawmill Junction's county office, and peeled it open with his thumb. 1 sheet of paper. Heavy stock. A single paragraph in formal legalese. "Notice of injunction by order of the county court pending investigation of civil disturbance, property rights violations, and unauthorized residency." Tom read it twice before speaking. "They're trying to take the land." Ayasha took the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning each word with growing fire. "On what grounds? They're claiming the homestead title's incomplete," Tom said. "Calling you an unlawful tenant. Says the land can be seized pending review." Elias stormed up the steps a few minutes later, having heard from a ranch hand who saw the deputy ride off. "They're using paperwork now," he said, winded. "Mallory's cousin works in the records office. He's been whispering about this for weeks." Ayasha folded the letter slowly. "Controlled. They couldn't run us out with fire or bullets," she said. "So now it's signatures and stamps. Oppression doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a suit and ties its noose with red tape." Tom paced the porch, fists clenched. "I've owned this land for 28 years. Clara and I built it from dirt. Buried her here. They can't just take it." "They'll try," Elias said. "And if the court sides with them..." Tom didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ayasha stepped off the porch and walked out into the field. The wind blew her braid over her shoulder. She looked over the hills like someone memorizing the horizon for the last time. "We fight this," she said without turning around. "Not with rifles this time, but with truth." Tom looked at her, the weight of frustration thick in his chest. "They don't care about the truth." "No," she said, "but the people watching might." That afternoon they rode into town again, this time not just to be heard, but to be seen fighting back. The town hall was quieter than before, tense, as if it had braced itself for their return. Tom carried the injunction, Elias walked behind them, and Ayasha she led her shawl replaced by a clean white blouse and her medicine pouch still tied at her waist. Inside, Councilman Willoughby pretended to be surprised. "This isn't a hearing." Tom threw the paper onto the table. "You want to take my land, you say it to my face." Willoughby frowned. "This is a legal process. It's out of our hands." Elias scoffed. "That's convenient considering it was your hands that lit the fuse." Ayasha stepped forward. "You can hide behind paperwork, behind codes and signatures. But this land is older than your office." Willoughby looked at her. "Miss Morningstar, you're not listed on any deed. You have no legal claim." "I'm not here because of paper," she said. "I'm here because I bled for this land. Fought to protect it, planted roots in it." Tom added, "And that makes her more a part of it than any name you scribble down in a courthouse." Sheriff Amos stood in the corner, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken yet, but his silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was calculating. "You'll get your day in court," Willoughby said. "Until then, the injunction stands." Ayasha's voice cut through the room like steel. "Then we bring the court to us." Later that evening, they gathered allies, Rosita Preacher Wells, the blacksmith's wife, and even a few ranchers who'd stayed quiet too long. "We need testimony," Ayasha said. "Witnesses. Proof this injunction is revenge, not law." Rosita raised her hand. "Mallory said it in my store. Called her a squatter. Said he'd find a way to cleanse the county of outsiders." Preacher Wells added, "He cornered me outside church last Sunday. Told me I should remind Tom what God thinks about mixing blood." Elias looked around. "They're using hate and paper. But we've got people." That night, Ayasha sat by the window, sewing a tear in Tom's shirt, while he scribbled notes by lamplight. He paused, watched her fingers move. "You still think we can win this?" he asked. She didn't stop sewing. "I think we can show them who we are." He set the pen down. "And if they don't care, then we win anyway," she said, "because we didn't bend." The next few days passed like a slow storm, papers filed, affidavits signed, stories gathered. A hearing was set. 3 days from now. But Mallory wasn't waiting. On the eve of the hearing, someone slashed the horse's water barrels, broke a window, left a cross of stones at the barn door, a silent threat wrapped in superstition and spite. Tom found it before dawn. I picked it up, crushed it in his hand. "They want us rattled," he said. Ayasha placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let them try." She'd spent her whole life being told where she didn't belong, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be. In 3 days, they'd walk into that courthouse not just as defendants, but as a line in the sand. And Mallory, for all his power, would have to answer for the one thing he'd underestimated. They were still standing, together, unbroken. The courthouse in Sawmill Junction hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. By mid-morning, every bench was filled with ranchers in wide-brimmed hats, townsfolk in clean Sunday coats, elders who rarely came to town, and young ones clutching their parents' hands. It wasn't just curiosity that packed the room. It was a division. A quiet line had been drawn through the town, and today everyone came to see who would stand on which side. Tom adjusted his collar as he stood beside Ayasha at the front of the room. She wore her simplest dress, soft brown cotton, with her beadwork sash. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just honest. But her presence was thunder. Across the aisle, Frank Mallory sat smug in a tailored vest flanked by two men with slicked hair and city pens in their front pockets. Lawyers from the Capitol. Bought ones. The judge was an older man with gray whiskers and tired eyes. Judge Howard Clemens. Fair by most accounts, but small-town fare still had limits. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The room stood. The trial began. The county prosecutor started with maps, deeds, and technical jargon meant to confuse. He used terms like irregular claim, improper transfer, squatter, liability. Tom's jaw flexed. Ayesha sat still, eyes narrowed, listening. When it was Tom's turn to speak, he walked up slowly. No papers, no performance. "I built that land," he said. "With my wife. With my hands. And after I buried her under the cottonwood tree, I stayed because I couldn't leave her." He turned toward Ayesha. "And years later, this woman came. Not to steal, not to squat, but to remember. She was a child once. I pulled her out of floodwaters. She returned not with a claim, but with heart." Mallory's lawyer objected. "Relevance," Judge Clemens held up a hand. "Let him finish." Tom looked out at the room. "She earned her place not by ink on a page, but by how she lives. If the law can't see that, then maybe the law ain't worth much out here." The prosecutor scoffed. "Emotion doesn't override documentation." Ayesha stood now. The room went still. "Your law came after our roots, but it doesn't make your map more real than my memory." She walked forward slowly, voice calm but cutting. "You call me a trespasser, but I remember the grass on that land before the fences. I remember the river before you rerouted it to feed your cattle. I remember where our sacred stones sat before dynamite, and progress turned them into gravel." Mallory shifted in his seat. Judge Clemens leaned forward, listening now. "I didn't come to take anything. I came because I was saved there, because I was told to stay brave. And staying brave means standing up when someone tries to erase you." Rosita was called next. She swore on the Bible, then said loud and clear, "Mallory told me he'd run her out." Called her dirt. Said people like her should be pushed back to the hills. Gasps. Murmurs. Even the judge frowned. Preacher Wells stepped up. "That woman lives with more grace and faith than most of my congregation. And if that land means anything righteous, it means it belongs to those who love it." The prosecutor objected again. "This is hearsay." The judge waved it off. "This is testimony, and this town needs to hear it." Ayesha was called back to the stand for questioning. Mallory's lawyer tried to catch her in contradictions. I tried to push her. "Were you ever officially deeded the land?" he asked. "No." "Then by your own words, you have no claim." She looked at the jury. "I have no paper, but I have blood on that soil. I have nights spent guarding it, crops I planted, animals I healed, storms I endured. If that's not a claim, then maybe your laws are blind." Tom could feel the tide shifting. Not fast, not dramatic, but one person at a time. Even Judge Clemens sat quieter. Mallory couldn't stay seated anymore. He rose. Loud. "This is a circus," he barked. "She's manipulating everyone, playing the sympathy card. She's not even one of us." Ayesha's voice cut across him, steady as steel. "Then who are us, Mr. Mallory? Men who burn barns in the dark, who sends others to do their violence, or those who stay face you in daylight and ask for nothing but the right to live free?" Judge Clemens banged his gavel. "Enough." The room fell into stillness. The judge stood. "I'll return with a decision tomorrow." He left. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ayesha looked at him, her hand finding his. "They heard us," she said. "Enough?" he asked. She didn't answer. Because that wasn't up to them. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with folks who hadn't spoken in months. Neighbors, strangers. A few even nodded in silent support. Rosita passed them a wrapped basket. For strength, she said. Back at the ranch, dusk settled in like a weary blanket. Elias sat on the porch, whittling. You shook that town today. Tom nodded, and maybe cracked something open. Ayesha stood beneath the cottonwood, where the wind whispered through half-dried leaves. They think this is about land, she said softly, but it's always been about voice. Tom joined her, placing a hand against the tree. What if the judge doesn't rule in our favor? Ayesha looked at the sky, stars blinking awake. Then we keep standing, because they need to know we won't disappear just because they close their eyes. Tomorrow would bring a verdict. But tonight, they had peace. Not the kind handed down by courtrooms, the kind earned by standing tall in the storm. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. No coughs, no whispers. Just breath held tight in lungs that had spoken too much the day before. Ayesha sat still, hands folded in her lap, Tom beside her knees shaking under his worn jeans. Elias in the back row, arms crossed, his usual twitchy energy, subdued by something heavier than anticipation, resolved. Judge Clemens entered with slow steps, carrying a single sheet of paper and eyes that looked older than they had 2 days ago. He took his seat. No dramatics, no gavel. I've reviewed all testimony, he began, voice gravelly. Documents, deeds, oral accounts. I've weighed law against practice, fear against fairness, and silence against truth. He paused. I looked directly at Ayesha. There are those who say the law must be rigid to be just, that a person's name on paper is all that matters. But out here on this land, justice is not just ink and ownership, it's stewardship. It's a sacrifice. He turned to Tom. You protected that land, Mr. Whitlock. But you didn't do it alone. He faced the room. This court finds that the injunction filed against Mr. Whitlock and Ms. Morningstar is without standing. Further, a formal amendment will be filed naming Ayesha Morningstar as co-holder of the Whitlock homestead title, effective immediately. The land belongs to those who stand for it when no one else will. The room exhaled, some with relief, some with disapproval, but no one spoke. Tom blinked, lips parting, but unable to find words. Ayesha simply closed her eyes, not in disbelief, in quiet, unshakable gratitude. Mallory was already gone, had slipped out before the final words. Cowards usually did. Outside, the sunlight felt different, cleaner, like the dust had settled, if only for a moment. Rosita hugged Ayesha first. Never doubted you, she said, even when the town did. Preacher Wells offered a handshake to Tom. That land's always had spirit. Now I know whose it was. They rode home slowly, not because of fatigue, but because they didn't want to rush the first stretch of peace they'd earned. The cottonwood swayed gently as they approached. Tom reached out to touch it, as he always did. This time his fingers lingered. Elias broke the silence. So, what now? Ayesha smiled softly. Now we build. That night, under an open sky and a crackling fire, they cooked beans over the flames and shared a bottle of old whiskey Tom had been saving since Clara passed. For what occasion? Elias asked. Tom looked at Ayesha. For this one. Ayesha leaned her head on Tom's shoulder as he rested his hand over hers. The land around them, scarred, tested, and burned, was finally still. But this wasn't the end. The town would talk. Some would call it a fluke. Others would say it set a dangerous precedent. But the truth had finally spoken in a voice they couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, people came to the ranch to help rebuild the broken fence, to bring over extra lumber, to leave behind jars of pickled vegetables and firewood without a word. And slowly, Sawmill Junction changed, not with parades, not with declarations, but in how people looked Ayesha in the eye, in how they greeted her name, not with a pause, but with a nod. in how children stopped whispering and started asking questions. Tom fixed the porch roof. Elias dug a new water line. Ayesha planted seeds she'd brought from her grandmother's basket, wild tobacco corn and sagebrush. It wasn't just soil, it was a promise that the land would hold more than crops. It would hold memories. It would hold a voice. One afternoon, a small boy rode up on a donkey. He handed Ayesha a folded note and rode off. It was written in pencil, crooked letters signed by a girl named Lily. "I'm glad you stayed. I want to be brave like you." Ayesha folded it carefully and placed it in her journal. She didn't need monuments or medals. That note was more than enough. And so the story of that ranch, the one nearly taken by fire, law, and hate, became something else entirely. It became legend. Not because it ended in victory, but because it stood for something more powerful than any court could grant belonging. Not given, not inherited, but earned every day with calloused hands, tired bones, and a heart that refused to leave. Tom and Ayesha never left that land. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had found exactly where they were meant to be. And when the cottonwood bloomed again the next spring, it bloomed fuller than it had in years. Roots deep, branches wide, unshaken, unyielding, home.